Hi, everybody. Today I chat with Kevin Maes, someone who has been working on the cutting edge of many technologies for a very long time, especially as it pertains to generative computing and art, where you programmatically generate media such as animation, sounds, mazes, and combinations of things and more. This is a fun conversation where we dive into a bunch of fun topics, so let's get started. All right, Kevin, great to chat with you. So before we go further, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Krupa. Sure. My name is Kevin Maes, and I'm a software developer. And I currently live in Philadelphia, right outside of Philadelphia. But I've actually been living for 15 years or so in New York City up until the pandemic. And right now I work for a company called Stately. It's a startup in the developer tooling space and collaborative engineering space. But I've been doing a lot of different things over the years. I got started way back in, let's say, the Flash days or even earlier than that. So it's been a wild ride, and I'm still going. I love it.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I really want to chat with you is that you've always done a lot of interesting creative things, starting from the Flash days, but even continuing onwards with that. So I definitely want to go deep into that particular topic. But before we get there, though, how did you get started? When did you decide that I want to get into Flash, I want to go into development? Walk me through your earliest days where you were like, this is going to be interesting.
Sure. Yeah. If I think back, I mean, I guess I started in the internet really not as a developer. I was doing things like content creation. I guess my first internet job was actually as an educational writer on a team traveling around the world, writing for a website that was used by students. It was called the Odyssey World Trek for Service and Education. And so we were a five-person team, and we traveled through Central America, South America, Africa, different places. But then that actually brought me to Israel, and for various reasons, I lived in Israel, and I started working in startups there. There's obviously a thriving startup culture even back in the day, and so we're talking about the year 2000, for example. And I started working in things like tech support and copywriting. And I had a lot of time, during some of those jobs, and I actually just started teaching myself Flash from a book. I feel like the Karate Kid scene where he's like learning how to kick from a book. But I learned from one of those Peach Pit Press books or whatever about Flash Forward, which was all just fun and games and timeline and animation and art and things like that. So I know you know all about that. So
Yeah, no, I'm looking at all the books you have behind you, and a lot of it looks very familiar. Of course, the Flash 5 box from Macromedia, that's a very classic. And I believe I see the Flash Map Creativity book behind you as well, which is like, which edition was it? They made like several editions, right? They like every couple
yeah,
of years had a new version of it.
Yeah, I don't remember which one, which where it falls, but that's so fun. I mean, that introduced me to the whole world of just like artwork and some of the generative art stuff and like fractals and all kinds of fun things. And I guess as a young kid, I was kind of a math geek. I mean, I don't really think of myself as particularly proficient in math as an adult, but I was always interested in math as a kid, and so it's interesting to see like which elements of those carried over into the programming world, but mostly for fun and stuff like that.
Which is always sort of an interesting tangent in some ways because there's always this question about how much math do I need to know as a
Yeah,
developer? And it always depends on which stack of the problem you're trying to solve. And I always, held this controversial view, well, to myself primarily, that I think if you're a front end developer doing more creative things, you probably need a little bit more math than you might actually anticipate. Beyond just the simple arithmetic, you might need to know about like trigonometry, like cosine, sines, and all of these kind of things.
yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because really, trigonometry was the only thing that I really needed to like dust off, and kind of read up on again. And the funny thing is that like I only end up using it like every now and then, so I just always have to kind of go back and like blow it off and like kind of refresh myself. But yeah, other math, I don't really use. I mean, the computer is really good at math, really good at calculating things like that. So yeah.
One of the things that I found very interesting about math in general is that when I was studying math and like all these things, you'd always hear about like how it applies to the real world and how it applies to computers and things like that. Yet it never quite resonated with me or made any sense. Like you see these symbols, you're like, okay, I get it. I'm going to read it for the exam. I'm going to forget it immediately the day after. Recently, I had to figure out, I was just curious to like, okay, calculating pi is a very complicated topic, and there was an article where I believe I might have actually been Google where they solved pi to the largest degree in a digit so far
Mm.
that's been kind of calculated. I'm like, okay, why is this a hard problem? And I went back and I looked at like the equations that were used for it, which weren't really complicated equations in the grand scheme of things. It's just like it's like the typical kind of integral, and you had like a number, and I'm like, oh, I remember this from school back in the day. It turns out they can actually plug it into like VS Code and like run a quick JavaScript program to calculate pi, not to that degree, but to a small degree, by translating that into like a for loop and things like that. I'm like, wow. After like almost 20 years, I actually learned it, in school. It finally clicked that a for loop can be in many ways used to, approximate an integral, and then the starting and ending conditions are literally what I'm doing here to calculate the value of pi. This is one of those things where I don't know if that click happened like 20 years ago, my path would have changed significantly. Where I was like, I just want to do product management stuff, not going to development. It's not what I want to do. But it's just one of those funny things that I keep thinking back to, like every couple of days. I'm like, wow, I wonder how many other things from my education that I just haven't applied in a meaningful way because it just never registered back then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find a lot of like direct connections between those things, but definitely there's sort of like transferable knowledge I think about a lot. It's just a little bit more about my background. I mean, I didn't study computer science at all, and I studied music actually. And to me, I did, and I also studied. Actually, I studied opera. I wanted to be an opera singer back in the day, and so I studied foreign languages. And so to me, there was always this kind of interest and passion and connection between things like studying math, which is technical, to studying like music theory and foreign languages, and then those are just like languages, and then you can apply like language constructs and concepts to programming languages clearly. And so there was always sort of that kind of continuity between those things, with the sort of background of like building and creating as well.
I'm going to have to ask this then. Do you think programming is an art or a science?
Oh, gee. I think, I mean, it's probably a bit of both, right? I mean, when you think about it, though, also, programming or functioning as a working developer, I mean, it's also so much more than either of those things, right? I mean, there really are a lot of, you know, skills that you need to communicate, to be a good communicator, to have empathy, to, be a good teammate most of the time. I mean, I've obviously at different parts of my career been like, developing by myself. In fact, that's largely how I feel like I started. But of course, at other times, I've been totally a team member. I mean, I'm a team member today. So, you really kind of need to have a very well rounded, I guess, approach towards programming that's artistic and scientific and also collaborative.
Cool. So let's get back to your interest in generative art and being able, or just generative designs and creations. What was one of the earliest things you created where you were like, this is a lot of fun?
Yeah, I mean, so back in the Flash days, we did all kinds of gratuitous stuff, if you recall. We would just anything that could follow the mouse would follow the mouse in a trail, that didn't end. We would pack as many things onto the screen, and then actually we'd have to then worry about things like performance, and that was really interesting. Like let's say having hundreds of thousands of objects and ways to optimize that. But I guess from the very beginning, when I was teaching myself, I mean, I would literally just stay up until 4 a.m. like night after night, just playing, and it was the most fun, satisfying way to learn. It was just experimenting. I mean, the Flash days, you would just hit like Command Enter, and you would just like run whatever you did. You'd be like Command Enter, let's see it move. And so I did a lot of things with like also with sound and let's say homemade vector graphics. That was also really fun in that IDE or that authoring environment, because you could like import images, and then let's say break them out with that like trace bitmap or whatever it was, and you can create your own vector art that was a custom. You could I didn't even use like more sophisticated tools like from Illustrator and freehand, like the Bezier tool and things like that. I mean, I would just literally take like a line and I would just push it with my mouse to make a curve. I would push it the other way, and I would like make all these like totally new artwork, and it was super fun. And then you could just animate that stuff. But then by the time let's say ActionScript, basically when Flash 5 came out, which is that one over there, then it was like full on using code to make things move, right? and it was much more intuitive to actually use code. I mean, even for someone who wasn't really a coder. So it was easy to kind of just set positions and to animate things. And so I would, oh gosh, what do I make? I mean, just websites, different presentations. I did a lot of gaming, all kinds of games. So, for example, educational gaming, even online games, card games, um, yeah, all kinds of things like that. So.
A common theme I always hear is that you mentioned that you're not a coder, but you're able to use Flash and create code-like activities. And I always going back to I spent my entire career working on developer tools and frameworks and languages and platforms, and that entire area because I never grew out of that love of tooling essentially in many ways. And I always wonder how much the tools actually play a role in making people comfortable in the uncomfortableness of like something brand new. Because I've spoken to people who are pretty much very much in a developer mindset who like the visual tools of Flash. Like I didn't know I could draw like a shape or something very quickly and then do my coding work in it. And you're playing the opposite in many cases where you started off using the vector drawing tools and then you naturally grabbed it towards the code side because the tools made it very, very easy. And of course, you're working on tooling right now in some ways with stately. At some point, we can talk a little bit more about that. But it's actually interesting in that the trace bitmap one is one I always remember because it was fun to play with it because the output you never know what it would ultimately look like. It always had if it was
Mhm.
an image that could naturally be traced nicely, it would look pretty good. Otherwise, it'd be a puddle of like various colors everywhere.
Mhm.
And I didn't have the fastest computer back then, and so the more I tweaked like number of corners and edge, I forget the terminology at this point, but you had like some numbers you could tweak that would
Right.
determine how fine grained each of the dots of the approximation would be. And then if you cracked up to a certain point, it was almost guaranteed your CPU would spin and then Flash would become unresponsive. So to me, like it's always the most memorable moments of the trace bitmap feature.
Yeah, it was really a balance between how detailed or granular you want the threshold to be set to, or how long it's going to take to actually do this thing. But yeah, it was really satisfying, and again, because you could just make art that just it didn't exist before, graphics, and I really loved the immediacy of being able to like hand draw. Like I would literally hand draw. A funny story. I actually had like a company for freelance work, and I created my own logo. And then several years later, I actually saw that somebody like stole my logo and used it for a web development company in Sweden, like with the same name. And of course, I knew it was mine because like I moved every single pixel of that logo by hand. It never existed. It wasn't a photo. So that's kind of funny. That, it's very personal to create this kind of art.
How did you find that? This is probably before the days of Google image search, correct? Or like the reverse image search they had.
Yeah, I mean, this was probably like when Google had just come out, and I was probably just looking, to see if there's any other company with the name, and then I did find it, and it was funny that it was actually a web development company as well, uh, just by chance.
Yeah, which is always the irony of it, because if you do any kind of naming, especially today for like, in a corporate environment, for example, there's always a trademark search that needs to be done. And they always check, the name is okay if it's being used in the same way. But if it's the same company, the same style, like, you're doing a web design company called Kevin Maes, someone else doing a web design company called Kevin Maes, probably not going to be fine. But if it's like one is selling like,
Right.
paper goods and heavy industrial solutions and the other one's like new web development, that's fine. No one's going to get, complacent there. So, it was an interesting world back then where a lot of things you can get away with very easily.
That's true. It was a Wild West. I mean, it was really interesting to learn. I mean, that's why actually, I came across your site. Krupa was so helpful back in the day. I mean, let's face it. There was no Stack Overflow. There was obviously no things like CodePen and Code Sandbox and all those things too. But the resources were often like hardcover, hard books or softcover books, which I always loved. Actually, I still like books. Because sometimes I'll take a book when I go on vacation. I'll just like take one book with me, and it's the thing I have in my hand, and I'm sitting on a beach or whatever, and I just love like reading and learning that way. So it's really fun to have something like that.
Do you prefer books because there's no interruptions that are possible with it? Because you can also get PDFs on iPads and so on. And so curious to know why you prefer books.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't use the books as much now, but like I said, I guess it is kind of a way to focus, because you're only going to carry like one of these things, whether it's like to a cafe or whatever. And so it's sort of like, this is the one I'm going to get through, on this trip, that type of thing. So I do like that. I also like being able to jump around and, kind of like look at the appendix, or look at the little tips and things like that. I like that style. I like the organization of the books in terms of like the little boxes and little call outs and things like that. So there's something about print. I mean, some of the early stuff I ever did with computers was actually with like desktop publishing. As a teenager, I mean, I learned like Quark Express, and I would actually design some print like brochures and things like that at random jobs that I was doing just for fun. So that's kind of got into it from the graphic design perspective, albeit without any real training. So I don't think I really stood up to the competition, but I did my best and it was fun.
I always wondered this, right? Because a lot of people who are very successful, like yourself, do not have like formal training in graphic design, but for example, but create an output that was really good. So I always wondered, it's a combination of having the ability to look at an output and say, this is good or this is bad, and then the curiosity to kind of just figure out things along the way. I wonder if that is actually probably more of a signal of being successful in a field than it is to have like the raw knowledge of something.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that, for example, sometimes when I've worked with designers, I never try to presume to be the designer, but it is really fun to like see someone who has all those skills and all that experience to kind of, see how they may, in some cases, maybe validate things that I had just like a hunch about, and that I had a feeling, but I don't know how to articulate it. And so it is interesting. And I think also from that, I also learn. And you also do get a little bit of a confidence of just like, there are a lot of people's voices need to be part of the conversation. And sure, sometimes it's like the client or whatever. And sometimes I know that you had a talk with someone, we were talking about how like the people making decisions, are sometimes, like less knowledgeable even than the people doing the work. But there's also just different kinds of users, and so there's different perspectives from some users. The design's going to speak to them. So I think just being part of the conversation is fun, and I love also being on teams where we get to do things like participate in user interviews, and research, like even at the design phase or the ideation phase, even just to kind of prove out concepts before actually getting to engineering. So that's been really satisfying to work on projects like that.
It seems like you've been through almost every stage of a software lifecycle, everything from like ideation to coding to developing to actually doing research. Which part do you enjoy the most?
I mean, I think that I probably just like sitting down and building things. But I do feel that I've done a lot of other things that do sort of help bring other perspectives, and those include things like even like a lot of engineering management, or what else? Yeah, just like a lot of people and engineering people as people related things like that in my jobs, and working on things like mentoring or education. This has definitely helped me to be a better learner. Obviously, if that's one of the things that I always found, like whenever I would like tutor, in school, it was just really a way for me to learn and to feel like I kind of owned that knowledge a little bit better. So I find that very helpful.
Yeah, I think it's a triangle of like how well people retain knowledge. And I think teaching back to somebody something is one of the best ways to both prove that you know what you're doing and also stick it in like some form of long-term memory in your brain so you never really forget. And that's one of the motivations that I still have for like explaining things and talking about various topics is in many ways it helps me articulate my thoughts better and also helps me figure out what's important and what's actually not important for this particular situation, and then have the right level of elevation to talk about like how high level do you need to be or how much in the weeds do you need to be as well.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that really fascinated me about what you're doing, right, is that you started, doing generative kind of art and music and things like that back in the day. It was a very crowded space. There were a lot of people doing very similar things. And I just curious to know who are some of your favorite designers or developers who are doing really interesting generative art?
So if I think back to the people that I followed, I think that Joshua Davis was, one of those names that really stood out. I saw him speak at conferences. I think, yeah, I mean, I definitely followed work of like Jared Tarbell. Um, a lot of this stuff comes from conferences. But nowadays, for example, on Instagram, you can follow all kinds of people. To be honest, I don't know everyone's name, but I do know something exciting when I see it, so I like it and I follow it. And it's always interesting to think of, like, they're using all kinds of tools. I mean, some people use, back in the day, Flash. Some people use processing. Some people, I don't know what else they use, but it's always interesting to think of, like, oh, can I apply that, to whatever language or tooling that I'm using today, which is, typically JavaScript. Some of the stuff that I've dabbled in has been with like P5.js. So basically, I didn't really use processing, but it's kind of like processing inspired port, to JavaScript. And that's some of the stuff that I played around with. Of course, there's like Canvas, which is kind of a successor to a lot of this stuff, because it had the absolute positioning and all these things that, we knew from Flash. So yeah, in terms of people though, yeah. So I guess I continue to look for inspiration from different people.
Do you remember Hugo Nakamura? Hugo
Yeah, I
P.
was I was going to mention that too. Yeah, I mean, Hugo P or whatever.
Hugo P.
Uh,
Exactly.
yeah, I always wondered what happened to that to Hugo P. But that stuff was amazing. It was like, it had like physics based motion, and it was really really cool. And I always loved that stuff.
And he also had like very trippy sounds as well. It wasn't like the
Hmm.
kind of melodic, harmonious music. It was very jarring kind of sounds depending on what you were doing, which is very similar to like art installations you might see in real life when you go to like a more modern art museum, for example. You often see things where, like, lines suddenly come in, you hear like a very sound, but it was interactive. You could actually control it, and that to me was always the most fascinating thing about all this art that you mentioned. Oh, by the way, completely random tangent. Do you know
Hmm.
Jared Tarbell, right? I think all of us went to his website. We always saw his like cool experiments and so on. Do you know he was a co-founder of Etsy?
Yeah, I did know that actually. I did kind of look that up. Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Because before, we had podcasts and I could talk to people like you, in real time. I did text-based interviews with people back then. So I talked to Jared, when he
Oh,
was just a PhD student. I believe he was in, New Mexico at the time, doing all of his
yep.
interactive artwork. And so I said, like, hey, can I ask some questions for the website and so on? And he was talking about all the cool stuff that he was doing. And then, like, many years later, I'm like, wonder what Jared is up to. And I'm like, wow, he co-founded Etsy from, like, that level of things. It always is fun to kind of see like where people end up going. And even now, every now, like Yugo Nakamura, for example, I just maybe like once a month or so, I just go back and go like, what are all the various people that used to do things doing, and what are they up to? Like, do you remember Ultrashock?
Yeah, sure.
Yep. So Patrick Miko, he's still doing, like, he does generative art and music now. And so I pinged him on LinkedIn a while ago and said, like, hey, Patrick, what are you up to these days? It's been like decades. Actually, we never spoke, So I'm like, what are you up to these days? And like, it's just fun to like catch up. So if you ever like get the opportunity, Kevin, just find people that you might have known from like back then. Just reach out to them, ping them. They're often like very excited to actually hear from people, because not too many of us from that time still talk fondly about like generative art and things, like, day job, things that get in the way oftentimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would definitely love to connect with some of those folks, but it's also interesting to think about, like, how the downfall of Flash happened and what it, like, where people went. I mean, it was really kind of like a fall of an empire. It was sort of
It
like,
really
some
was.
people scattered and went to like Unity, and some people just, switched over to HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Other people, they kind of just remained and, worked in whatever, ads and things were still being done in Flash. And yeah, it's interesting. I was part of a community in New York City for Flash developers. It was like the Flash JS meetup or something like that.
Yeah.
And we used to meet like every Wednesday in a cafe in the Greenwich Village. And then I guess a few years ago now, we had like a reunion, and that was so interesting to see everybody and see what they're doing.
Yeah, the funny thing is that I never really, I should have known this, but there's still a thriving community of Flash developers even today. They use other tools to get their, especially in the game area. I recently chatted with Matt Roshak. He created the Epic Fantasy Battle series, the EBF. You might have, it's a very popular game that people play, and he still uses Flash today. He uses like a version of Flash from like, not the latest version, because like there's some things that it doesn't support officially properly, but he still uses Flash, still publishes to the game store, and is still actively talking about like how do you make these things work in ActionScript and so on, which is really funny.
That's very cool. Yeah, I want to check out his work. But that was interesting. I didn't realize that you could still like use some versions of Flash, or that you could port things
Correct.
over to Flash, supported by Rust and things like that. Yeah.
because when we used to, remember it was like, control enter, right? You could see the flash player up in a little window. You
Yeah.
still have those kind of tools today. They don't run in the browser anymore, but they run in their own self-contained area, and they can
Mhm.
publish directly to the iOS store and the Google Play Store with really good performance, as it turns out. The name of those tools are escaping me. We actually, geeked out basically on like what are
Mhm.
all the tools that you can use today to make all this, Flash content compile into things that work more natively. But it turns out they've been doing this for a long time, and the performance is extremely good. And it's been quite compelling to see like what can we do here now.
That's cool. Yeah, over the years, I have ported some of the things over to, just things like code pens and stuff like that, just to get them running in something more modern. But yeah, and I still have some of those old, FLAs and, and things like that
Yeah,
around.
but you mentioned though that when Flash died, like a lot of us scattered away. It is very true because usually when something comes in to replace it, there's often like there's a natural progression of like, okay, we Flash had its era, now we're using the next set of things to work on. But I think with the Flash suddenly going away, there was no next set of things to really jump into. It's basically you can go back and do more static or animated visuals, like in After Effects that was always
Mhm.
still there, but it wasn't interactive anymore. And if you want to do things more programmatically, you didn't have too many options, especially if you cared about the reach of what Flash had, right? It could just send you a file and you could just view it. I think WebGL was just about to get up and running. Mr. Doob, one of the other, I think people who did like generative art Flash things back in the day. I think 3JS, he's the creator of 3JS. I think he was
Mm.
just starting to do like the early version of 3JS. Processing, of course, was huge and it was Java based and it was interactive. It was kind of cool. And I think that was Amit Pitaru, correct?
Yeah, I'm not even sure, but yeah, processing
Yeah,
is
and he
great.
had a really cool website as well. I don't know if you remember this, but it was basically just like lots of dots that would constantly keep moving to create shapes that would be animating. So it's like people would be moving and things like that. And it also had like really interesting sounds behind it as well. So you could just see like all these like many, many particles moving on the screen, creating in an individual visual. Then will disappear and go and create another visual. So it was like an entire sequence of events entirely done in real time in the browser using Java at the time.
Hmm.
So that's actually really fun to see all of that. Now, you then, one of the things I always remember is, you talked a lot about Maze generation, and I was talk to me more about that. Like, how did that come up?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's just a really fun thing that I got into, I guess, a few years ago. The story was I was actually in the Barnes and Noble with my young daughter at the time, and she was like reading a book, and so I found like some bargain book about mazes, and I was looking through these, and I'm like, oh, these are really pretty, and then I was like, I wonder now, I never really thought about like how mazes were made. So then I kind of did some research on it, and it turns out there's like algorithms, and there's whatever. So I tried it out, and that's where I kind of, I guess, first started working with the P5 JS, just kind of creating some of those things. And the most common algorithm is just like sort of like a recursive backtracker, which is like a depth first search
Yeah.
algorithm. And so I just did that, and but over the course of doing that, I did realize that like, oh wow, there's so many other like algorithms and different ways to make mazes where you end up with different visual results and different patterns, and that kind of got me my creative juices flowing. And so I started like just doing things like this on the side for fun. Didn't have a lot of time to put into it, but I also ported things over to Canvas, and then I kind of slapped on like a React UI because I've been working in React for several years. Things like that. And now I'm actually going to be. So I did give like a little lightning talk back in Sitges. I guess that was several years ago already. And I'm going to be giving like another lightning talk about the same subjects coming up in September, also in Spain, in Alicante. And I guess what's different about that is some of the technology has changed. The stuff I'm using, but also I'd love to just kind of work on some other ideas that I have, and combine it with some of the work that I'm doing right now. So, for example, the talk is going to be about the algorithms, but the talk is also going to be about state charts. And state charts, which is sort of an extension of finite state machines, is something that I'm working with every day at my job at Stately. And so this is going to be kind of like a fun talk about algorithms and visualizing those, and then actually turning those into working code, and hopefully supporting multiple algorithms, to kind of demonstrate some of that. So we'll see what happens between now and September, but I'm really excited about that.
No, I think it's going to be pretty exciting because maze generation is one of those things I've always been fascinated with because I had like a lot of books on this mazes and like both from the historical point of view, like all the mazes that you can see naturally occurring, and then like fractal patterns in like corals, for example. In many ways, it's kind of a maze where if you are a piece of
Mm.
sand that gets stuck in one of the areas, you can navigate your way through the currents to the ultimate destination, all the way to like the more modern games where you have mazes that are part of just like your overall story. And the part that's always kind of confusing and also difficult about maze generation is there are multiple parts to it. I touched upon the algorithm of like being able to find a path that you can ultimately make it through.
Mm.
The other one is actually generating the maze itself, the visuals itself. So how do you do that?
I mean, so basically, you just come up with a. So the idea is to. It kind of comes from graph theory, and if you basically consider edges and vertices of a graph, and you apply them to what looks like a grid. Now, this is presuming that you have let's say a maze that's all squares, right? Which obviously you can have them be triangles or hexagons or whatever. But essentially, you have a grid, and you can basically just keep on visiting different cells in the grid, and you can break down walls, and you basically with the simpler algorithm, which is the backtracker. You basically just keep on seeking and breaking down walls until you hit a dead end, and then once you hit a dead end, you basically go back to the last place where you could have made another choice to visit a different neighbor, and you just keep on going until basically everything in the grid has filled out, and so it kind of really draws itself, which is something that I always thought was mesmerizing. When you're watching this thing, especially if it's very fast, because it just kind of goes and draws itself. And if you have a very large grid, I mean, it just kind of speeds along, and it's really, but it's always random. And that's another thing that I remember, back in the Flash days, is that we had a lot of things that were random. There was always like, make this random, make that random, motion is random. And so this is kind of like a legitimate use of that because now we don't necessarily want all of our user experiences to be random. They need to be predictable and that kind of thing. But this is one area where in arts or mazes, the randomness is welcome.
Yeah, the do you know CSS is getting a random function?
No, no, actually, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I found out about it yesterday. Like yesterday afternoon, one of the people working on the Chrome team mentioned it in Twitter. It said, random coming soon to CSS, and I
Huh.
retweeted it. Of course, I'm like, okay, I don't use Twitter much, but this is worth actually signaling. Yeah, I think we're finally getting to the point now where the technologies we used back in the Flash era are more approachable to audiences where they want to do something visually without writing JavaScript code. They might be able to pull this off.
Yeah, that's great.
So let's talk about, you talk about stately and tooling. I want to talk about tooling in general. So have you always been passionate about tools and things like that? Or is it just one of those areas where you're like, I'm going to try different things that have interest in many areas, but now I want to try tooling a bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've always been passionate about tooling or creating tooling, but I have been a user of those things, and I think that what happened, with let's say things like state machines and stately, is probably 5 6 years ago. I don't know, 2017, 2018. I came across some talks by David Koshid, he's the founder of Stately, and he's also the creator of the XState library, which is the state machine library for JavaScript. And you know, the presentations were like so clear and so enticing in terms of like, wow, this looks like a way to kind of create order from the chaos that is like this sort of bottom up programming where you just kind of like slap on event handling here and you just handle things as you go. This was like a way to kind of step back and plan, what is the system going to do, what is the software feature, what are the things that are possible, what are the things that are prohibited. And that really spoke to me, I guess, because of the real life challenges that I faced in the software that I was developing for many years prior, probably all the years prior. Um, and it was the kind of thing where also when I think back to like the games and things that I made, I was like, where was this back then? This would have made things so much easier to manage and say like, this is what these characters can do. This is what's possible. So I got really interested in like kind of following, some of that stuff and learning about that. And I gave like a little talk at a conference, and then I started to kind of spread the word at my company at the time. I was working at a consultancy in New York City called Giant Machines, and I was super passionate about that. And everyone, they knew I was going to like, talk about this like state machine and like wanted you to think about this. So I was kind of like spreading the word there. And yeah, and then I found that it really was a great way to like think and plan out your application, and then also to maintain it, because you have this plan, and because you're using an actual JavaScript library like Xstate, then your plan is the code, and it stays in sync because it can evolve with your application. So when the feature needs change, then the code is in sync with that too. So that's also pretty powerful.
In many ways, the state machine, like the state in many ways, it's like a keyframe which you had in Flash, and you create a
Mm-hmm.
series of states, and then you wire the logic between how the tweening ultimately happens. Now, I've always been a big fan of this space. One of the things I started working on when I first got out of college is I worked on a product called Expression Blend at Microsoft. And one of the things we always thought about is how do we make it possible for someone who's not very technical, who's more of a visual kind of a developer who knows what they want to create, how can we help them actually create UIs in a way that still translates into ultimately working applications? And the idea that is always inspired by was, if you look at music tools, a lot of music tools are cases where, like, if you look at them, the mixing boards and things like that, you often have like amplifiers and like visual things you tie in between one to the other. Like the output of one particular filter, for example, is the input for this particular amp. Then it goes back to another filter, and you ultimately design the output. Of course, is the sound or the modification of the sound. But how you generated that was not by writing complex logic or doing all this like high pass, low pass filters. You did it visually. You were like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
here's what I think needs to happen to make the sound wave go in the way I want it to. So I'm going to do this visually. That being said, the application development has always been like one of the things that so many companies have been exploring and trying it out. And Stately is one I'm very familiar with because of my interest in this space. I've always been like tracking both the library that was going on, and then also, of course, the company itself. So it's actually really exciting that actually working with them on this exact same problem.
Yeah, it's been really exciting. I've been there for about a year, and what we're doing is basically taking application logic, and we're using the tooling to make it visual and also collaborative. And I think this is again, it's really interesting opportunity for me to kind of dog food those tools and to use them even while developing, let's say, Stately Studio, which is the platform that we have for developers and for also non-developers as well. So it's really great to be able to like learn about this and work with it, and then actually help to produce the tools to help other engineers. Because I imagine myself also consuming this stuff as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because based on what you described, like your hobbies and interests are, of course, you seem like a perfect person to try out like the low no code version of some of these tooling to make this work. So speaking of course, no code and low code and so on, we have talked about this AI. You know, when I look at some of these things, right? We had professional, I call it pro code. We had like you had to write code to get everything done. Then you had low code and no code tools, which in many ways, solved a lot of problems, but the problems that were solved are often narrow in scope and you're often limited in terms of like what the tools ultimately supported. We saw this example when you opened up, Flash and Flex were great examples of this. If I open up a Flex file in Flash, things work fine. But if I modify the MXML manually, even by like one character, Flash would be like, I don't recognize this anymore. I can't do the design surface, do everything in code. And that was always made the awkwardness between like Adobe Air and Flash like a little bit different. It's like, yeah, same technology, same underlying representation, but the workflow never quite, went properly. And so the most successful low code and no code tools were ones that did not give you direct access to what was going on behind the scenes, because they knew that if you started modifying it in
Hmm.
ways that the tool would understand, like you go from tabs to spaces, for example, you double comment something, for example, the tool's like, I don't recognize it. I'm going to recreate the entire thing and I might blow away your changes as a part of it. With AI, I feel like there's one more area that's come up in this case. Just like what Midjourney was able to do for people creating graphics and visuals, where I'm not a talented designer or graphic user, but I can type in things in a more natural way by like using text or describing it, and then I can get qualified at measuring the output of kind of things. Kind of like we talked about earlier about how you were, doing some of these things and you didn't fully know, like, you were a graphic developer, graphic designer, like a publisher by any means, but you were good at analyzing the output of it and be like, yep, this is good, and that was very successful in these areas. where do you see AI playing a role in this world? Like, is it going to be one level of abstraction beyond what low code and no code tools bring, or will no code tools ultimately just become AI agents in their own way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just getting started in the space, so I'm really just kind of learning all the time. But my feeling is that like there's going to be a really great augmentation for the kinds of developer tooling that we're doing, from AI. And I guess one way I look at it is if you think about, right now we have tooling that syncs, let's say, a visual editor, with diagramming, with like live diagrams with code that actually can run your application. But there's so many different ways to like input into that system or into that ecosystem. And so if AI can help us, let's say when you want to create a system, maybe to find other systems that are very similar and, to be able to suggest things like that, or maybe to be able to flesh out some of the details of the content for you. Also, these are very visual. So, anything in the AI space that's actually visual, whether it's like creating images, I mean, maybe those things can also augment these tools. So that's one thing I'm very curious about. So I haven't really had a chance to work with that directly, but I definitely look forward to doing that in the next year.
In your personal projects, have you used AI for, like, let's say, maze generation or any of its generative art? Have you used AI for bits of it?
I haven't really used it, but I've actually been very curious to get started. So for example, one of the questions that I have, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but let's say that you ask Midjourney to create, a maze of this type or whatever. Like, I don't even know. Like, can it create a maze that is actually traversable, or is it just going to create a pattern that looks like a maze? That it has lines and has space and whatever, but it doesn't actually do the calculation because it's more like a visual processing of other data that it's seen.
So I've actually tried this exact same thing, and it depends on how you prompt it and how you
Hmm.
do like the exact details for it. It doesn't, for it, it thinks of a maze purely in terms of a visual. It has no concept of
Right.
like there needs to be a path from beginning to end and so on. So oftentimes you'll see the maze, but there's no solution to it because the
Mhm.
walls aren't properly defined. And if you aren't prompted correctly, the maze becomes three-dimensional, like a hedge maze or the things you might see in the real world. Adobe's
Mm.
Firefly, which is another tool that is kind of really compelling in this area, it does a better job on it. And it's big. I don't know what is different about it because I think what Adobe says is that all their visuals are trained on images and visuals that aren't like copyright protected. So it's basically things that they've generated themselves from their own massive library. And so it seems like in many ways maybe a smaller data set, but the quality of it has been really really good. And so it even can provide you a vector version of it, which
Mm.
means that you can generate a maze in Firefly, download it as like a vector kind of an art. Maybe you do trace bitmap in today's world to break it up, but I think the path from that to an SVG that you can now manipulate in any of the various JavaScript libraries, I think is very doable. I've never tried it, but I did play around with this like maybe a month or so ago, and a month or so ago in the AI world right now
Right.
might
It's
mean that they solved all the things I've been complaining about right now already.
It's funny you mentioned this sort of unsolvable maze because at one point when I was using this recursive backtracker, I was like, well, if we're going to start the maze, in this side and we're going to end, coming out the other end, what if I just generate this from both sides simultaneously to speed it up? So I actually just took like two starting points and then just let it go, and you end up with this gorgeous maze. But actually, they don't meet because the rules of the algorithm are such that they don't necessarily have to meet. So then I was like, well, that's not a solvable maze. So you have to kind of like artificially go and like break down one wall so that you can actually get from one end to the other. Another thing that I think would be really interesting, which could have to do with AI, but also just other technology that's more modern, which would be like combining 3D, with mazes. Because if you think about those games where you would like, I don't remember the names of the games, but where you're basically in a maze and you're navigating space, I think it could be really interesting to take like a two-dimensional generated space and then create like a three-dimensional generated space that you could actually then navigate through, almost like a game. I mean, it's basically you're like a rat in a maze, but that could be really interesting and complex. And also totally random and bespoke.
It's very much like, I don't know if you ever played video games like back in the day in many ways, but the first version of Wolfenstein 3D, for Wolfenstein, actually, not Wolfenstein 3D, it's Wolfenstein by itself, was very much seemed like a maze. You were just in this like blue building, and you just go in, go to a door, turn left, turn right, turn left, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And it literally was just a maze in so many ways. Especially all those like FPSs from back then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I do remember playing something that was like a maze, and it was 3D, and you would go like you would get into, you go up, but you go down, things like that, and that's really fun.
Like I think if a portal also comes to mind sometimes in terms of like what can be like maze like, but also be 3 dimensional. But I think it's very much doable because you know, I- if you use ChatGPT for like generating code snippets, for
Hmm.
example, you can actually tell it, generate me a 3D scene that needs to be able to represent rooms and things like that. The challenge, of course, is that you need a whole lot more. You need a lot of scaffolding to be able to make this work. And you might get an isolated snippet of something. And then
Hmm.
you're trying to figure out, okay, now how do I make it work when I'm looking up, something else happens? That snippet might not be directly related to what you had earlier. The variable names may be different, or might have a different, idea of like what X, Y, and Z might look like. And there's a little bit of translation that needs to be done as well. So I think it's going to be probably, a short while away where we can actually just be like, tell me, get generative maze for me that does all these cool things. But I think the technology exists out there. You just need someone to kind of put it together between Unity, between ChatGPT, and then maybe visuals to create in any tool of your choice. I think it's doable.
Yeah, I'm excited to look into it more and to see what's possible. And like you said, it's changing so quickly. So by the time I look into it, something else will happen. But it'll be very inspiring to see what's possible.
I definitely think with like WebGL, getting a lot more investment and interest, WebAssembly getting a lot more investment and interest from various parties around the world. I think it's going to be very likely that we can actually see these things working in a very performant way, just like we might have been able to do with like the Shockwave player, before, yeah, Shockwave, because I think that was hardware accelerated, where Flash I think wasn't fully.
Hmm.
So that's going to be a lot of fun. Well, Kevin, this has been great chatting with you on all these various topics. And I'm looking forward to your talk that you're going to be giving on Maze Generation in the future. And at some point, I want to, share some links that you've kind of created of mazes that you can actually play with as well. So it's a fun topic to share with everybody on this.
Yeah, as I develop things further, I'd be happy to share things out. And Cooper, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great. I'll talk to you in a bit.